BookStory, and we're really fortunate today to be with Aaron Sheehan-Dean, a friend of mine. I will acknowledge right off the bat, which you may flinch when you see just how mean I'm going to be with these questions I have for him, who's the author, among other books, of The Calculus of Violence: How Americans Fought the Civil War. It's a really handsome book for Harvard University Press, very substantial. And Aaron, we really appreciate you coming and joining us here on BookStory today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Ed.
Good, good. So, let me ask you a question that I get sometimes. Hey, there have been 54,000 books written about the Civil War. Why do we need another one? What would you say if somebody was rude enough to ask you that question?
My mother-in-law asked, and I said, "You want your kids, your grandchildren to go to college, don't you?" And that's probably not a good enough reason.
So we'll build on that. What else you got?
I think that the historian's answer is that we need to, despite all those books, we need to think about history as we change. And so every generation comes back, particularly to this most important moment in American history, and thinks about its relevance in different ways.
Are we making progress? Are we getting any closer to something that we would consider to be a balanced and insightful interpretation?
I think we are. I mean, particularly on this question of violence, there's been a clear sort of development of the literature over the last 2 decades.
Right.
And I feel like that conversation itself has evolved in a productive way.
So basically you're saying we need this book because we kind of don't have any choice. We have to keep wrestling with this defining event in our history. And this question of violence, which I think you've, identified more clearly and helpfully than anybody else who's written about it. But what I want to know is, how have our ideas, not just among historians, but among Americans, how have our ideas about the violence of the Civil War changed since the, let's say Reconstruction after the Civil War? How have Americans' conceptions of what that war was about evolved?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think certainly there's a sectional response. That is, there are differences, and The Lost Cause is in part built on a kind of a mythology of unbridled Yankee violence,
right.
directed against white people primarily in that view, and that has a memory that stays alive. I mean, most of my students, for instance, I teach at Louisiana State University. Most of my students don't know that William Tecumseh Sherman was our first president.
Of the university.
Right.
Yeah.
There's no building on campus named for him. I mean, I would defy you to find a university in the United States that doesn't have the first president kind of lionized everywhere.
Right.
And that's because of this, what I think of as a kind of false memory of what Sherman's campaigns in Georgia primarily, although they were worse in South Carolina, what those are like. I think certainly since Vietnam, American historians have been more forthright about trying to understand what actually was the nature of violence in the war. And
let me interrupt you for a moment. That's
Yeah.
a long stretch between 1867 and 1967.
That's
right?
true.
So did our idea, and we certainly know that representation of Reconstruction you're talking about at LSU was sort of crystallized and gone with the wind. Do you think is that kind of what shaped the minds of so many Americans?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, you only need 1 or 2 scenes from Gone with the Wind to kind of set that idea of what violence looks like, right? It turns up in The Simpsons in the trampoline episode that I'm sure you know. And
that's another interview, Aaron.
Yeah. I think that certainly Union veterans pushed against that. And Union veterans, we know now, articulated a confidence in the mission that they were accomplishing, both in terms of preserving the Union and emancipation, well into the 20th century, rather. And a part of that was pushing against this notion that they had been rapacious in their treatment of Southern civilians. But I do think that kind of reconciliation that happened certainly by the 30s and 40s enabled Northerners to perceive maybe what that was in fact the leading edge of modern industrial war. And so that those interpretive strands kind of blend togetger in the mid 20th century, I think.
Right. So they were at Vietnam, where you were before I jerked you back. And
no, that was fair. I mean, So there's certainly been a lot more honest writing about the nature of violence and the ways in which, for those Northern soldiers that wanted to celebrate what they had accomplished, being forced to reconcile with the violence, the unnecessary violence is the phrase that I use that happened, because there was a lot of it in the Civil War. And I think, particularly in the last decade or two, there has been a turn by scholars, influenced, no doubt, by the contemporary experiences of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, to think about what was that violence like for those people who committed it? What was it like to be a veteran who came home from the Civil War? Diane Somerville's new book deals with this. I mean, I had a PhD student at West Virginia who wrote on suicide and the sort of coping strategies that soldiers used, really around this question of what's it like to come to a war as a volunteer with no real expectation of the kind of war that the Civil War develops into.
So a large part of what's happened is we've broadened our vision to not just about who were meaner, the Yankees or the rebels, instead to think about the consequences of violence for everybody, right?
Yeah, I think that's the case. I mean, the literature around prisons for a long time has been very much a kind of tit for tat. How many died and were they as bad? And certainly Mark Grimsley's book, The Hard Hand of War, from 95, maybe. I mean, that really kind of opened up, I think, a conversation that was more precise about, well, what actually occurred and what does hard war mean? There's a big difference, and I make this argument, between logistical devastation and lethal violence.
Right.
And logistical devastation brings suffering, but it isn't lethal.
Well, we're going to pull this apart a little bit. So the phrase that you use that strikes me as very helpful is that it's a catastrophic war that could have been more violent, you know? It was catastrophic. And so you're not trying to deny all the suffering, but how could it have been worse than it was?
Well, a couple of ways. I mean, the principal problem inhibiting, or I would say facilitating unnecessary violence is the acknowledgement of who's a legitimate combatant. So on the Union side, the Union never recognizes guerrillas. And so those people are killed often without much more than a kind of drumhead court-martial. Those are combatants. I mean, they're irregular combatants, but it facilitates violence against civilians in some places when there's responses to that. The most significant one, of course, is that the Confederates refuse to recognize black men as soldiers, and so don't accord them the rights of being captured, of being taken prisoner if they're wounded on a battlefield. The Confederacy hedges on this policy, and they're inconsistent, but many of those commanders at the operational level don't take prisoners, and so black men suffer a much less just war. So that's on the soldier side. On the other side, I would say it's the decision by the single most important thing that lowered violence was the decision of enslaved people to not pursue revenge and to pursue freedom instead.
Now so there's so many things that you're talking about there, and that's one of the great things about your book, is you make us realize that violence is lots of different things and could have been lots of different things. So let's kind of go over that in the order that you introduced things, if you could. So you see a crucial difference between the Confederacy and the United States being the Confederates' adoption of guerrilla warfare. And that's something we've argued about for a long time. And it seems to me in the popular understanding of the war, one of the great things about Americans is that we didn't go to guerrilla warfare after Appomattox, right? That Lee was a gentleman and he could have prolonged, but instead he just handed that sword over and shook hands and went home. But that was not really the question about guerrilla warfare. When did the Confederates turn to guerrilla warfare, and why?
I mean, they turn almost immediately in many places. I mean, in Missouri, it starts in 1861. I mean, they turn when their own army fails. And so, for instance, the example I use in the book is Arkansas, the beginning of 1862, after Pea Ridge, the Confederate Army effectively abandons the state. And almost immediately, the commander there, Thomas Hindman, issues what is called the Band of 10 order, which is published in the newspaper and says, sort of, Confederate men, organize yourselves into groups of 10 and harass the enemy on the waterways or wherever we may slow him down without waiting for further instructions.
Wow.
Which is a kind of bold call to totally unregulated violence. And so it starts wherever there isn't a regular army.
So one of the interesting things about your book is you say there's not really a trajectory that the war goes from soft to hard, but rather that it's much more spatially distributed, right? So this would seem to be an example of that, that guerrillas break out when the Confederates feel they're going to lose otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, so that spike happens quite early, that
Yeah.
turn to guerrilla warfare. It would be easier if there was a kind of smooth linear trajectory. And I think the running assumption for all wars is that the longer you fight, the more brutal they become and the more you despise your enemy. And so the more you're compelled to more and more violent action. But I didn't find that to be the case here.
Now, wait a minute. So I'm inclined to agree with you about things, but I seem to recall that there was a burning of the Shenandoah Valley and, of course, Sherman's march burning large parts of Georgia. That seemed to be happening at the end of the war rather than at the beginning. Isn't that a turn toward, and civilians are the losers in that. That was not a pivot in the war?
I mean, I think it's one of the pivots. I think that what we see are, as you say, sort of in different regions of the Confederacy, different little epicycles of violence which flare and then subside. And what's important for the war as a whole is that these rarely achieve kind of takeoff velocity. That is, they don't cycle in and pull people into something. They tend to be localized and restricted, and they often wind back down. I mean, the example I gave in the Shenandoah Valley was that the conflict between Mosby and Custer. And there's an exchange there in which Mosby executes 6 soldiers. And sorry, Custer executes 6 of Mosby's soldiers, and Mosby responds by executing 6 of his and saying, "Don't do that again. What you did was a violation of the laws of war. I retaliated, and now we're even." And in fact, that was the last of that sort of event. So those certainly the war grows in scope. And I think the hard war's destructive capacity, Sherman and Sheridan are better at destroying things than they had been in 1863. And they have more men on the ground. And so, yes, civilians certainly suffer more at the end of the war. But it's not until 1863 that we get policies like the Lieber Code that govern what you can and can't do. And so that strikes me as a moment in which there's now material and policies that allow people to be held to account. They weren't present in 1861 and 62. So that makes a difference.
Well, it's also the case, isn't it, that even with Sheridan and Sherman, they're not committing violence against people. It's violence against property, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the key distinctions that I felt like had been lost in the recent literature, which is to sort of say hard war and let that cover a wide variety of sins. And logistical devastation, which means the destruction of railroads and mills to grind flour and foodstuffs and animals, certainly creates hardship for civilians. But even in the Valley or even in Sherman's march, it's very rare that there is any kind of lethal violence directed at civilians. And that, I think, is a very important distinction to make.
Is it the turn against foodstuffs and therefore involves burning down barns and fields? That's what people, and what I've studied in the Shenandoah Valley, they seem to take as a different thing than tearing up a railroad track or a roundhouse or something like that. And the outrage and even some of the kind of, I don't think guilt is the right word, but the condemnation in the North was, you're taking away these civilians' ability to feed themselves, to live. Was that seen as anything of a meaningful distinction?
It was, but I think it was regarded by military planners as legitimate for the time. I mean, it's not the kind of devastation of the 30 Years' War where the southern half of Germany is burned to the ground.
I want to take advantage of your comparative perspective in a moment. So that's certainly the case, and I think that you could argue that Lee was trying to do the same thing in Pennsylvania. He was just taking everything rather than burning it, right? And so that's interesting. That what you're arguing is that you have to take this concept of violence apart and not try to just call it violence or hard war. And so do you kind of shun any kind of quick terminology for all this, right? Do you have any phrase that you would like for it to be the Sheehan-Dean slogan?
Well, I mean, I would say that unnecessary violence is a different kind of measure. I would like to claim that as the Sheehan-Dean. It was actually Don Doyle, so I want to give him credit in a conversation, because I was describing to him what was going on, that what's the egregious part of the Civil War, because so much of the kind of 20th century warfare doesn't occur. So then you have to look at these moments when there's unnecessary killing. And guerrillas, in some respects, Grant sent thousands, or not, he sent a lot of guerrillas to prisoner of war camps, principally Alton, Illinois. We actually don't have good numbers, but there's hundreds and probably thousands. And most guerrillas could have been treated that way. But a commander on the ground whose soldiers have just been sniped at or one's been shot isn't likely to give that person the benefit of the doubt. I mean, there's very situational decisions.
Yeah, I felt the guerrillas were cheating to begin with, and so they had sort of given up the right to be. So this may be a phrase that you've heard. People come up and say, you know, God, I just love the Civil War. You know, I say, yeah, I know what you mean. You love learning about it, but you don't really love the Civil War. But I think they do mean it really. But in part of the charm of it for people today is that compared with almost all the wars that followed, certainly the Great War of World War I, that it seems kind of gentlemanly overall.
It does, and I think, I mean, in important measures, that's a verifiable or legitimate kind of categorization. Certainly among officers, there's a lot of management and diffusing of violence because officers were commonly trained, often at West Point, or they had read the same manuals, and they would resolve situations that in other contexts might have escalated. I mean, my book is an attempt to say it's not quite as pretty that you might wind up saying, I like it. I mean, I got that a lot, you know, in my first book on Confederate soldiers in Charlottesville, in fact, talking to a group there, and some woman who had been the head of the UDC there for 15 years. And she said, well, I knew the Yankees had substitutes, but why would any Southern boy want to hire a substitute? And I thought, you haven't been reading the right books. Right, read their journals. You know,
right, staying alive.
So, I mean, you know, right, the lice and the malnutrition and the dysentery. It's a horrific experience. Yeah. And so I'm not trying to overwhelm people with that, but we certainly should be aware of it.
Well, doesn't it seem in some ways that the theater at Appomattox, the handing over the sword and all that sort of was then read back into the war, that it was gentlemanly and restrained?
Yeah, and I think, you know, as William Marvel has noted in his book on Appomattox, the armies had to have pickets to keep them separate there. And part of the story there is, you know, what's fascinating in some respects is what happens in Durham Station when Sherman's army receives word of Lincoln's assassination. The things that Union soldiers say is, okay, now we're released from any obligation to observe the laws of war. And the Confederates better skedaddle or there's going to be a great bloodletting tomorrow. I mean, Sherman has to really rein in his army. It doesn't end with everybody sort of shaking hands and high-fiving, which is, I think, that kind
taking
of
their free horse and going home to their farms.
Exactly. Right. You know, people went home bitter. And
remain so for generations. Right?
And Sherman said, that's what I want. I want them to go generations before they would think of this again. So that part he was effective with.
Now, you mentioned earlier that in many ways you see quite a few parallels between the United States and the Confederate States, but the big difference is basically the refusal of the Confederates to recognize the right of Black men to be soldiers. Right, so their very existence feels to Confederates like a violation of the laws of civilization. Is that right? And what are the consequences of that?
So the consequences are twofold. The story that we've already, I mean, both of these stories have been out there. I think I was trying to bring them together. One is that because Confederates refuse to recognize Black soldiers and to take them as prisoners, the U.S. also stops exchanging prisoners. And so the result in 1864 is a mushrooming of the prisoner of war population, and that's what generates an enormous amount of unnecessary death. You know, all of the soldiers at Andersonville, but also at Northern prisoner of war camps. That none of those had happened in the first 2 years of the war because both sides were exchanging prisoners. And then the other is, of course, the gross mistreatment of Black soldiers, most famously at Fort Pillow, but at Poison Spring, Arkansas, and at Saltville, and at Plymouth, North Carolina, and at the Crater. I mean, there's a lot of these episodes where Confederate commanders refuse to allow Black soldiers to surrender. And the evidence is all from the Confederate side. I mean, the Union offers evidence as well, but it's not as though these are sort of post-war revisions of what happened. The testimony of Confederates at Fort Pillow is quite shocking and awful to read. And these are soldiers.
It's bragging sometimes, in fact.
Sometimes it is, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, so if the Civil War is in many respects a just war, when it's white soldiers in uniform on battlefields, the war happens according to, if you want to call them the gentleman's rules of war or the laws of war. If it involves black soldiers, it's often an unjust war.
Well, one thing that occurred to me reading your book again is how much race does shape this. And I'm thinking about the violence inflicted against indigenous people before, during, and after the American Civil War. So how much of this gentleman restraint, even on the battlefield that you're talking about, is not something you would have seen in wars against Native Americans. So can you talk a little bit about how the Civil War is an exception in many ways to the way that Americans have waged war against other peoples?
It is an exception. I mean, and the ironies are quite palpable, right? I mean, so that during the Civil War in the North, it's Democrats that are calling for strict adherence to the laws of war, which they were certainly not doing in Mexico, and wouldn't have dreamt of doing when facing Indian enemies. And so it is a weird kind of interregnum. And I mean, Mark Neely has made this point that as between white men, the war was reasonably well contained. Certainly when, and I would say one of the glaring absences in a book that, as you note, is already on the long side, was really...
I didn't say it was long. I said it was substantial.
Substantial, thank you. Was me dealing thoroughly with the mistreatment of Native Americans. And the most famous episode is the uprising in Minnesota, the Sioux there, and what eventually results in the execution of 38 leaders of this movement. Initially, the Minnesotans had wanted to execute hundreds, and Lincoln scales it back to 38. There's nothing even remotely comparable for the treatment of white enemies in the Civil War. And so you're right that race is a kind of crucial point of difference here that really
exacerbates everything else, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so, well, how about gender? Now, you talk about sexual violence here too. Do you think we can actually see the sexual violence that would have occurred during the Civil War?
We can see some of it because both armies, well, we can see because some of the armies prosecute their soldiers for it. So the Confederate court-martial records were burned in Richmond. We have scattered examples of those, and they're not very thorough. The Union has all the court-martial records. There are 200 men executed in the Union Army. About 110 of those are executed for desertion, 90 for murder and rape. Most of the murders are murders of officers in the Union Army. That is, a soldier got drunk and stabbed a tent mate or whatever. But there are 35 or 40 prosecutions of rape that end in execution. There are many more. If we'd gone to the general court-martials at the Army level, there would have been many more prosecutions of rape that end with time in jail or hard labor or dishonorable discharge. So there is evidence that the Army is policing this. I know, obviously, that there is a lot that doesn't get into the record here, so we can imagine that the total volume of women subject to sexual violence is much higher. But I mean, I did try to work through those court-martial records in a way, and then obviously the kind of manuscript records where this material turns up. Marcina Patrick, who's the provost marshal of the Union Army of the Potomac in 1864, is vigilant about this. And there's a rape accusation that's quite easy to substantiate. And he receives notice of the charge in the morning, and the men are executed that afternoon.
Wow!
I mean, they investigate, they charge, investigate, prosecute, and execute. And he wants to make an example of them because this is a far beyond the pale of sort of conduct unbecoming, or some of the charges that no doubt included things that didn't rise to the level of verifiable rape.
That's very striking. Would this have been racialized as well? Were any of these men prosecuted for raping African-American women? Well,
it's racialized both for the defendants and the victims in this case. So black men are prosecuted at higher rates than white men. There's a kind of striking differential in terms of the number of black men in the Union Army. We shouldn't see nearly as many prosecutions of rape if they were occurring equivalently as they would with the white population. And then certainly, I think it was easier to bring a rape prosecution for white women coming to the Army. They got a sort of warmer reception from those officers. And we know from anecdotal evidence that black women were subject to more sexual violence than white women in the South were. So, and that story still needs to be told in a much more thorough way. I know there are people working on it right now.
Well, it's important for you to put it in the framework of, military history and of all that. So that's a real contribution as well. So, one of the wonderful things about the book is you pull the camera back both geographically and chronologically. And so let's do that ourselves. So if you pull the camera back geographically, how does the American Civil War change in its appearance?
So there's a couple of episodes that I sort of use here as comparative points of reference, most of them contemporaneous with the Civil War. And the most important one here is the Taiping Rebellion. Americans, because we always want ours to be the best, I hope, because so we claim, well, we had more deaths in the American Civil War than any civil war in the 19th century. And it's not remotely true.
That's not even close.
The Taiping Rebellion, I mean, the old official is 20 million deaths. There are Chinese historians now that are saying maybe as high as 50 million, wow, which is an incomprehensible number. But
and the highest number in the United States right now is 750,000.
750,000, yeah, for the U.S. And at the granular level, so in the Taiping Rebellion, which is, effectively a civil war there in southern China.
When was it?
1851 to 1864. So the latter half of that is exactly contemporaneous. Next book is going to be on this, so a more thorough kind of treatment of these comparisons. But when the Taiping or the Manchu would lay siege to a city, they would usually barricade that city and let it sit for months, cutting off food and water. And they would open up the gates, and there would be tens of thousands of dead people from cholera. Just horrific. And the sieges in the U.S. Civil War take 30 days. The siege of Atlanta, 45 days of shelling. 20 people die. I don't know how you could shell a city continuously for 40 days and kill 20 people. But and then Sherman enters the city and distributes rations. The Confederates actually still had rations of their own to distribute. Nobody dies of cholera. There's no smallpox outbreak. So the scale is so it helps us, I think, as in thinking about the U.S. Civil War, to consider that and to consider the way violence manifested in other conflicts.
So let's pause there just a little bit. Famously, defenders of the Confederacy say it's not a civil war at all. But something just recently I finally understood. I never could understand how it was the war between the states, since I thought it should be the war among the states if they were going to do that. But what it turns out to mean is a point that you make here, is that they're saying the Confederacy was a state. And the United States was a state, and so that's how you could have a war between the states. And it was not really a civil war the way that the fighting in China was. Can you comment on that?
No, Lincoln, of course, never accepts that it was a state. Right? He's always talking about the so-called Confederacy.
Well, I'm going to pause there because that was a question that we received from one of our listeners, and so we can figure out what that means, right?
Yeah.
So Michael Vinos writes, and he says, one thing I was interested to learn is that Lincoln would often refer to the Confederacy as the so-called Confederate States. Michael is interested in if that's something not unlike the way that President Trump kind of calls things so-called in a way to sort of deflate them in a minute. But what did Lincoln mean by the so-called Confederacy? Why? It was killing American citizens. It seemed to have some kind of reality to it.
It was a real thing. But for him, secession was impossible. Not just unconstitutional, but it couldn't happen. And so the goal of the Civil War is restoring normal relations between the states. But he has to
only
adopt,
thought they had seceded.
They're just confused temporarily, and 300,000 dead people later were. But so I think what Lincoln has to do immediately, really, in early 1861, almost as soon as the conflict starts, is in fact sort of a de facto recognition that it is a regular war. They are a legitimate combatants, and he does this by taking prisoners. This is the sort of first important way that it de-escalates the violence, because in the initial days of the war, there are Northerners that say these people are traitors, and if we hang a few of them, then they will know that we mean business. And Lincoln, I think wisely, says that's not the right way to proceed here. And even though he will never admit it publicly, there is in fact correspondence between them, just as enemies correspond. And there's prisoner taking, most importantly, that establishes that convention of regular warfare of the kind between states.
So that was interesting and answered the sub question that I asked. But I'm just wondering if your comparison with China and then also in Mexico, maybe you could talk about that a little bit, suggests that this really was a war between states and not really a civil war in the sense in which it's everybody against everybody. Or maybe I'm misunderstanding what a civil war is.
No. Well, so the example from Mexico that I would use is actually not the U.S., the Mexican-American War, but in fact the caste war of the Yucatan, which is also nearly contemporaneous, runs from the late 40s into the 1850s, although Mexican historians would say that it continues on really almost until the 20th century. Wow. But in that, a group of, this is the Yucatan Peninsula, which is basically trying to secede from Mexico, and conducts a kind of guerrilla warfare to do that, but they're never pursuing statehood. And so the result is an enormously more violent and destructive conflict there. Hundreds of thousands dead in a much smaller space and a much smaller population, massive refugee problems. Having a state to kind of organize is crucial to minimizing violence. And so the Confederacy does become a state. They don't achieve European recognition, and that's an important point, but they are functionally a state. And that helps structure the way the war happens in important ways.
Well, they don't know they're not going to get European recognition. No, matter of fact, and a large part of this really is, it's a kind of a theater. Look at us. We're a civilized state just like you. Recognize us. And so there's a certain kind of checking of their own violence. Is that a fair way of saying it?
Yes, well, at least they represent themselves as having checked their violence. That absolutely, that one of the key elements that determines if you are a state is obeying the laws of war. And so they are constantly in the kind of European media trying to represent the atrocities that the North is committing and then their own complementary restraint. And don't you see who the real civilized nation here is? So a big part of this is the kind of PR battle for European attention.
Because we're used to thinking of the Civil War as kind of free for all, but you're pointing out it's actually quite orchestrated because you do have two states or one would-be state and a real state kind of controlling themselves because they are looking over their shoulders at what the world is saying about them as well. And also, I guess, to maintain order inside themselves, right? I mean,
yeah, I mean, I think, it's important that these are both democracies. They are not our democracies. And so people get, I can see why people would say, well, the Confederacy was hardly a democracy. They're both slaveholding democracies. But because of that, they need to respond to what their people expect them to do.
Right.
And so the way you fight a war is an expression of who you are as a people. And the public, in both the Confederacy and the Union, provides in some sense an escalating kind of drive, and in other cases, a kind of break on violence, because that's not who we are. That's operating.
And we will fight battles, and even the Confederates kind of dress up guerrilla warfare as something other than guerrillas, right? They're partisan rangers, right? They're kind of semi-official soldiers, right?
Yeah.
So by expanding geographically then to look at Mexico and China, we recognize that the American Civil War is a proportion of the population who died, or as the duration of the violence, or of its danger and threat to civilians, refugee populations. In all those ways, the American Civil War was a relatively channeled war. That is a fair way to say what you point out?
Yeah, that is a fair way to say it.
Okay, now if you pull the camera back chronologically, how do we see the American Civil War different?
I mean, in some respects, again, it sort of stands out. I mean, it's not, and I mean, Mark Grimsley made this point a long time ago. If you go back to the 17th century, particularly the 30 Years' War, but other wars, I mean, the Revolution had a fair amount of its own really excessive brutality.
I've seen that Mel Gibson movie. I know just how violent it was.
We tend not to tell that as a part of the story. It's nothing at all like the 20th century to come. And this is part of, I mean, I didn't use the language of total war deliberately because that term strikes me as hopelessly fuzzy and not very analytically useful.
Right.
But we know
World War I total war?
World War I, well, I would say yes, although I mean, the term is coined by Air Force planners in 1947.
Okay.
But the degree to which non-combatants are subjected to violence in World War I would suggest that it's a total war, and there's nothing equivalent in the U.S. Civil War. And so it was a total war in the sense of full mobilization for the Confederacy. Everything in the South is going towards the war, but the lines of violence are much sharper than they
right?
are.
They drew the line at the enslaved population. They weren't.
Well, that's true.
Right?
Yeah. Well, that last 3 weeks, right?
Yeah, right. So, but that, I mean, so the Great War is a war between states. Why was it so much? I don't want to get us too far off the American Civil War, but it's very interesting that, sometimes, as you said at the beginning of our conversation, people jumped from the American Civil War to Vietnam, right, as a way to kind of chasten the Civil War or get us over our kind of proud nationalism to show that's just kind of what we're like. But you're saying if you look at the world wars of the 20th century, how about the wars of the 21st century? Are they showing the American Civil War in a new light?
Well, I mean, clearly I was writing this book during Afghanistan and Iraq. Yep. And so some of the questions that we have, that we were talking about publicly were obviously on my mind. I mean, this issue of statehood is very important, it seems. And so the difference would be between, say, Al-Qaeda, which as a stateless entity has no responsibility to civilians. It doesn't need to protect civilians. It doesn't need to promote itself in the international arena. It makes it much more difficult to fight. I don't know that I want to go on record as saying ISIS is a better opponent. I don't have an ISIS flag at home, but I think in some ways as an entity that is binding itself to space and consequently to the people within that space, it allows us to interact with them in a more productive way, in a way that would hopefully diminish violence. That it can't if you are truly a kind of trans-global terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda is. And I think it's been very difficult for the American army to kind of anticipate how to respond to that threat.
So in some ways, the United States was fortunate that the Confederate States did try to organize itself as a state.
It helped a great deal.
Yeah. Right. So you mentioned earlier that if you had asked white Americans at the beginning of the war, what's the greatest threat, it would be that the enslaved population would rise up in rebellion against the people who'd held them in slavery for 250 years. One of the remarkable things that doesn't happen in the American Civil War are really many acts of vengeance on the part of people who had every reason to be desirous of vengeance.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things that sort of occurred to me as I was looking at this, is that, I mean, somebody as liberal as Salmon Chase, who's Lincoln's Treasury Secretary and an abolitionist from the 1850s, Chase expects and is very wary of kind of empowering people of color in the South, enslaved or not, because he anticipates this happening. That is, that there will be a Haitian Revolution. And we've had a lot of debate in the field over whether the Civil War was the largest slave revolution. And I'm certainly happy and I agree with the ways in which the Civil War broke slavery, with 500,000 or more people fleeing. A seventh of the total enslaved population goes through contraband camps. But it isn't the slave revolution that white Southerners and many white Northerners were expecting. And that's the point that I don't think has been taken into account properly. It's not at all like that. I mean, it's very hard to find episodes of real vengeance. There are a couple of isolated cases, but it's kind of remarkable for the restraint that was exercised.
So how do you explain that?
Well, I would explain it a couple of ways. I mean, one, strategically, just as when slavery was intact, white people in the South have a monopoly on the tools of violence. They have an organized army still in the region. So it's extremely dangerous as someone who's trying to seek freedom to then stop and take up arms against, even an elderly, infirm master or mistress, because there's usually an army not that far away. And I think that enslaved people had their eye on something more important, that is freedom. That was the day that they had been prophesizing and anticipating and singing about, and it comes that close. That's where you move to. Frederick Douglass is very careful about this, right? I mean, he wants to bring both free men of color from the North and enslaved men into the army to regularize that violence. And there's no question that when enslaved men then become soldiers, they're going to fight with, tenaciously. But they are doing it within the structure of an organized, regular unit. And so that's lawful military violence. And so, I mean, I think it's probably too much of a stretch to talk about a tradition of nonviolence that goes back to the 19th century. I mean, I think that sort of Christian teaching played a role in this, in as much as it did for everyone. Americans, white or black, didn't like killing people. It's not an original thought. But I think if the choice is to pursue freedom with your children or to stay and burn the house down, most people pursued freedom with their children.
So do you think now that we are able to harvest so much of the work that other historians have done for other places, and that we've been able to unfortunately benefit from, 150 years of different kinds of war after this, that we come closer to taking the true measure of the Civil War?
I do hope we're closer.
Sure, question.
I think that the scholarship is quite remarkable. And I mean, you remember when I was sort of starting and, daunted by the scale of how much has already been written. But I'm sort of newly energized, almost on a daily basis with the avalanche of books that arrive. Our friend Amy Taylor, whose fantastic new book on exactly how does freedom happen.
Yeah.
I give a kind of glancing reference, and she's got this beautiful and brilliant book that sort of takes us through the contraband camps and through this experience, totally contingent. Some people, it sort of cycles back into slavery or into something worse in some cases. And so I do feel like we are now at a point of just knowing a great deal more about how this experience evolved.
But as you know, sometimes people liked it better when we didn't know as much and just made sweeping generalizations that people think of as being a strong argument, rather than these arguments with these epicycles and cycles and all that sort of stuff. So what do you say to people? Say, come on, bottom line, what was it about? What do you think? What do you say to people who are impatient with kind of sophistication?
Yes, as many people who listen to me say, well, it was violent, but it could have been worse. I'm not trying to be coy, but I think particularly for Americans today, pursuing a just war is a kind of a mythical journey. I mean, there is no just war in its totality. And the language of just war, which is quite precise, political scientists and philosophers spend years kind of parsing the various elements of what a just war is. And then in the popular discourse, it's just, was it a war that was fought to achieve an outcome that we today say is a moral good?
Right.
And there's no question that emancipation is a moral good. And I would also say that the integrity of the Union is also a moral good that's produced demonstrable gains. But that doesn't mean that the Union was consistently just or behaved justly throughout it. And similarly, the Confederacy also behaved unjustly at many points. And it's important for us to reckon with that, so that as we go into war, we are at each new point kind of recalibrating the calculus. The calculus is unique to each. I mean, just war is transhistorical, but the debates that you enter with your enemy about what's permissible and what isn't, those are in some ways reborn in each conflict. And we have to pay attention. We're obligated as citizens to do this. It's not just an army, it's us.
Well, I hope that the people who are in charge of deciding what our next war is, and the citizens who are charged with deciding if we support it or not, we'll have a chance to reflect on this wonderful book, Aaron. Thanks very much for joining us today, and thanks very much for writing this book.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Ed.
Sure, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Can't see the cursor.